Hello and welcome to Minor Compositions. Today, we're joined here by, you know what? I should have asked you how to pronounce your name before I pressed record. I'm gonna go for it. Hopefully, I won't butcher it. Lütticken?
That's pretty close, yeah. Yeah, Sven Lütticken, but of course it gets modulated and inflected slightly differently in each language. The Dutch say Lüttiken more than Lüttiken, for instance. But yeah, Sven Lüttiken, something like that.
I'm happy I didn't completely butcher, only butchered it in a minor way.
Exactly, yes.
Um, and butchering things in a minor way is definitely what we do here at Minor Compositions. We butcher many things and burrow into many things. And for this week, we're going to have a chat with Sven about the his book, which we just officially started rolling out a few months ago, which is part of our super happy cheery series of books. We've got Brian was we talking about fascism. We got you talking about catastrophe. It's just really the year of cheer and joy. Um, so we're going to have a chat about that. So thanks for coming along, Sven.
Yeah, thank you.
So where should we start? Which particular catastrophe do you want to start with? Or general catastrophe, or I'm just thinking about, you know, there used to be a point where it felt like there was one catastrophe at a time, right?
Right, or even one crisis at a time, right? And now it's an omni-crisis, or rather a polyvocal omni-catastrophe. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, it's like it was. You used to have like unique names, and you could associate the particular crisis with a particular time and a mood. But now it's just like you have to it's kind of like hurricanes. You need to like name each one and decide sort of like what part of the season it is.
Right. So indeed, that's, I suppose, also why I do not always, but at times write also about catastrophe in the singular. But of course, then catastrophe stands precisely for this condition and no longer for a single earthquake or tsunami or um, even famine or what have you. It is precisely about this entanglement and about the intensifying, far from abating storm of history, where indeed you can no longer necessarily clearly distinguish this storm front from that hurricane or, yeah.
Well, I find that interesting. And maybe I don't want to get too meta too quickly, but it's almost like when you're at a point, like Ben Hameen's Angel, when you're looking at, the piling wreckage,
Right.
and it's almost like how do you find a way to intervene with urgency, addressing the specificities of the particularities of different moments of crisis, but without, you know what I'm saying? Like you're trying to just go intervene and respond to different things at the same time, but it just feels completely overwhelming.
Right, exactly. And of course, there is this need also to respond to sort of the most urgent crisis of the moment, or what is perceived to be as such. So of course, at the moment, a lot of sort of attention goes out to Gaza, to Palestine. But then there's also the need to see this as part, indeed, of a bigger picture and as part of sort of an overarching, intensifying catastrophe in which also, for instance, Palestine is used as a lab, right, as a laboratory of sorts for necropolitical warfare, right? So it immediately, or I would say that it has to also be defetishized in that way. I mean, yes, there needs to be a focus, but this focus cannot mean that it's treated as sort of an isolated thing that just happens to happen there, obviously. So yeah, that I think is a huge challenge, actually, how to keep sort of a parallax view in a sense of those two scales, right? And how to square the circle in a way, how to square this need to focus on pressing specific crisis within the catastrophe with also focusing on the, let's say, the structural conditions and the unfolding logic of it all.
Maybe it's part of okay. This could be a weird comparison. You remember Steve Bannon, right?
Mhm.
Um, Unfortunately, I remember him as well. But he had this phrase where he would talk about the approach of, okay, I believe the phrase was to flood the zone with shit.
Yes. Yes.
And the idea that becomes that there's just so an overwhelming variety of crap coming through that
Yes.
you almost lose the ability to focus on any particularity because
Absolutely. Yeah, which is also a form of shock therapy, right? It's the shock doctrine. That's one way of basically articulating a version of the shock doctrine. You have to keep pumping it out, and people have to, once finally in a country like Holland, big protests about Gaza start happening and pressure starts building up about Gaza, about cutting ties with Israel. Okay, we already go into a war with Iran, right? You need to keep, I mean, I think that's also very much part of the logic, keeping up the pace and outpacing people's capacity to sort of process and absorb and respond. But yeah, I think even, apart from that, I think one sort of trigger for the book originally was also my experience of being in Japan and visiting Fukushima at the exact moment when basically things started shutting down. Countries were going into lockdown. And that sense of synchronicity, I mean, that was not even sort of orchestrated, flooding the zone with shit. It was just facing and physically experiencing this zone, right? A zone that has been flooded with radiation, if you will. Um, and it was about visiting that, engaging with people living there or people who have basically residents who have been expelled and artists doing project there at the same time as getting frantic messages, oh, you need to get out of Japan because you'll be stuck there. So I think that sort of synchronicity and those storms intermingling, I think that was also a bit of a trigger. So I think there's an element of design, if you will, the sort of Bannon dimension of flooding the zone with shit. And there are also elements where, or I would say there are also moments where you can see how there is also a relative autonomy at times of events that, of course, certain players then immediately also start sort of tweaking and okay, how can this crisis or how can that crisis be redesigned in a certain way. But it's not limited to that, right? There's there's a series of attempts by various actors to, in a way, structure events in such a way that, it results um, in types of flooding
Mm.
that are in their interest, if I can put it in those terms. Does that make any sort
No,
of
no, 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 that makes sense. And it's almost like we have to do is almost like latch on to the particularities of one crisis and then use it
right?
to almost like structure how you understand other things. So, for instance, if you're talking about what's happening in Gaza or Palestine, then you on the way that this is linked to the rise of global AI technologies
Yes.
and how they're being used by the military. So it's not just sort of like an incomprehensible wave of things. It's like no, here's how these things connect and here's how they're related. And so rather than being overwhelmed by it, you almost like, I don't know, provincialize the crisis, if that seems like
Yes. Right. So indeed, uh, being attentive to the particularities without, in a way, indeed fetishizing or provincializing the crisis. Yeah, I think that's what a lot of us are sort of trying on a daily basis. But because there is this constant sort of barrage by the Bannons and others, yeah, that is a perpetual challenge also.
Hmm,
Yeah.
yeah.
But in a way, then it also becomes important, I would say, to slow down and to also try to get out of the doom scrolling mode, right? Because doom scrolling is precisely an extreme form of sort of sensitivity in a way of susceptibility to getting sort of sucked into sort of this flooding operation. And, to some extent, you can also use that to, let's say, to be attentive, to sensitize yourself, but there is also an element of desensitization, of course, and you get sucked into a particular rhythm, which is 24 hours, almost 24/7, almost. It slows down a little bit during the night, depending on where you are, perhaps. but it's relentless. And so for me, I don't know what you think about this, but working with ultimately an anachronistic medium such as the book, right, is it's also about making time in a different way and about developing different temporalities and ways of thinking that perhaps are not always able to do justice to, the latest urgency, right? A book that deals with contemporary crises and a contemporary catastrophe. It's in many ways it's dated. It's outdated as soon as it is published, right? Because weeks or months will have passed. But at the same time, hopefully, this slowness of taking time to develop thoughts, developing an analysis of the structural conditions and of sort of the larger also temporal logic is still meaningful.
No, there's something really interesting there. I mean, I still love books for various reasons. Um, Parts of them are probably purely aesthetic or just 'cause I love them. But you also could also say that there is a certain temporality to it. Even though the nature of publishing, even book publishing, is changing in relation to different t technologies. But there
Indeed.
also is a dynamic of the kind of slowness, the kind of attention required to develop an argument over a book, and then attention to read and engage with it. Reminds me a bit of the way what's the book where actually it's probably across many books where Bernard Stiegler is talking about how the job of sort of is this book about youth and tactics, where one basically talk about sort of cultivating a sense of attention
Yeah,
with younger people and the
yeah,
ability to sort of yeah. And
yeah, and of course, yeah. Sorry, go on.
it's one of the things I think about a lot, in part because I mean, like for instance, my son's 13, and part of me finds myself wanting to say, get off your phone, get off the doom scrolling, but I want to do so without sounding like a boomer, being like, the phones are ruining your brain.
Yeah, yeah, but I mean, I've also over my lifetime, I've also, noticed how my brain has been rewired. Of course, it's happening even for dinosaurs like myself. But yeah, for Stiegler, of course, this is also very much linked to his analysis or his conceptual framework of proletarianization, right, and deproletarianization. And I do think there is a risk there. And you're also a teacher. I mean, to my mind, and you talked about attention, and we talked about attention and slowness. To me, teaching increasingly also has become about attention and slowness and engaging with arguments, and in a way, defamiliarizing also, and defamiliarizing certain habits, or challenging certain habits, and perhaps developing new habits or old habits in new ways, and learning how to read a certain type of text again. But I do also see that there's a huge actually desire for this, that there is, it's not just, let's say, I don't get the sense that it's me sort of imposing something. Yeah, I may impose certain texts, but I do also feel that there is among students, certain students, there's a widely felt urge also to, in a way, use the framework of teaching, okay, of a classroom. Okay, so why are we here? Well, perhaps that's one thing why we are here to, even though of course the curriculum may also be sort of overly stuffed and crowded with all kinds of distractions, and you have to jump through hoops the whole time in the edu factory. But there are still also ways in which you can use a university program, for instance, to take the time to focus on, for instance, on one of those books that you publish or that others publish, right? So, yeah, there are technologies in a way, in the sense of sort of the German Kulturtechniken, right? Cultural techniques that can and should be fostered, not in abstract opposition to in sort of some kind of Luddite opposition to some kind of bad other that you think you can keep outside the door, because of course you can't, and people may still check their phones in class, and I may do that myself. But at the same time, yeah, there's a real opportunity there, and also this form of collective reading, which is what seminars ultimately are also
Mm.
about, right? They are basically reading groups. And of course, there's a hierarchy. It's not an autonomous, self-organized, purely horizontal reading group, but it is a reading group of sorts.
One of my favorite instructors when I was doing my undergraduate degree was this guy called Rosta Coppens, and he started off every class by saying, "Ask anything." Like he would have 10 minutes for asking whatever anyone like, not even class related, just anything. So you could be
Mm.
like, what would sociologists say about space aliens? And he'd sort of respond or
Okay.
just like anything, right? And I thought it was really interesting because people at first they were like really uncomfortable with it, but then they would eventually start asking interesting random questions, and he come up with something to do with it. And the other thing he do it, which I quite liked, is on your exam there would always be a question of write your own question about this class that shows that you learned something and then answer it.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's getting maybe a little bit far afield. But maybe to start with sort of going back to your book a bit. One of the things you talk about is how you are you describe your project as historical theory. So I just
Mm.
want to think about sort of what do you mean by the idea of historical theory as opposed to sort of traditional critical theory or political theory or aesthetics?
Right.
What does it mean to write historical theory, particularly, I guess, when we're talking about, the conjunctures of different moments of crisis? Like what does it mean to sort of reclaim a kind of a historicity in doing theory?
Right. I mean, of course, this is just a very broad term, which of course also covers many forms of critical theory, quite a few forms of political theory, some forms of aesthetics perhaps also. So it's not meant as, some kind of specific niche that I'm introducing. It's a fairly broad categorization, and I always felt that okay, I was trained as historian, art historian, cultural historian, and I've always been a bit, in a way, reluctant to claim or to sort of don the mantle of, of a theorist. Um, in part because of perhaps for two slightly contradictory reasons. On the one hand, perhaps theory seemed to be too grand a notion. On the other hand, also theory seems increasingly also something that is quite that has sort of been used in such an inflationary manner, the term, right? That it's become almost silly, a bit silly, right? Oh, everybody is a theorist, which I suppose is also good in a certain way. So I now also feel that, yeah, if I, for instance, use this term of low theory, and also in relation to other types of theory, yeah, sure. As a historian, I've always actually also been engaged in pushing historical inquiry to the point where it has to become theory. So, producing historically informed theory and sort of theoretically informed history. And of course, that comes out of also my engagement with the social history of art, with critical theory, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not meant to be anything very particular. It's just a very broad categorization of what I arrive at if, as a historian, I sort of situate myself in this storm of history and in the intensifying catastrophe. And I can no longer, I was never interested in that to begin with, but I certainly less than ever, I can sort of claim the position of, let's say, a traditional bourgeois or liberal historian who is somehow, outside of the course of events, right, or some kind of 19th century historicist. So, yeah, this is also the sort of transformation of history, of historical inquiry into theory is also a necessity that comes out of this sense of being implicated and being affected.
Hmm. No, I certainly understand sort of a certain hesitancy around claiming capital T theory,
Right.
but maybe it's because I mean I'm so used to the idea of I forget who said it first. Was it David Graeber who talked first about low theory, or was it Jack
Uh,
Halberstam?
Could be. I associate the term with Mackenzie Wark, but I'm not sure. Perhaps that's also a very modernist sort of approach to always pin the term to one, originator. But I associate it with Mackenzie Wark, but I can also fully see that people ranging from Jack Halberstam to certainly also David Graeber would be on board with it, or perhaps even used it before Wark. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Well, because I remember in David's version of it, it's almost like you're observing certain things happening, whether in art or culture or ethographically, and then you're teasing out their implications, their
Yes.
functioning, and say, "Here's what I'm seeing here. Is this what you get?" And it's
Right.
it's less of a sort of like grand theorization and more of a sort of like a
Yes.
not everyday practice, but it's not as sort of a, there's no symphony behind it. It's just kind of like, yeah, here's some stuff. Does this make sense to you? And
It is occasioned by something. It is triggered by something. This is also why I quote Isabel Stengers, who I think sort of in a kind of riposte to the Cartesian cogito ergo sum says, something makes me think, right? There is something that makes me think. It's not me as a philosopher constructing a system, and coming out of art, there always has to be that something. It could also be a text, of course, perhaps read in a certain situation. But yeah, they can be artistic practices, these somethings. They can be all kinds of experiences.
hmm. Well, that reminds me of it, and I think this is perhaps one of the reasons when you first said in the book proposal, I thought it'd be interesting to do this book, is because of the way that you sort of introduce or sort of elaborate upon the idea of schismogenesis,
Mm.
which I remember correctly, again, not to play the proper name game, like, you know, that's first comes from Bateson, if I remember
Right.
correctly.
Yes.
But
Yes.
I thought of it mainly for the way the idea is sort of like teased out a bit more recently by the two Davids, Graeber and Wengrow.
Yeah.
And to me, it's something that seems like really intellectually interesting and productive about it, particularly at a point where a lot of contemporary politics and pop culture seems to be like Team Red versus Team Blue,
Yeah.
and anything that Team Red likes, Team Blue can't like, and it was like that sort of schismatizing tendency, or I'm not sure what
Mhm.
the way to
Or
conjugate that adjective would
yeah,
be,
yeah, yeah.
seemed to be like a really sorry, this is a side up, but like I find it really funny when people say like the nation is divided politically. Any nation that only has two major parties is always going to be divided politically.
Right.
That's literally how binaries work.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, of course, we can say that perhaps the binaries, yeah, or the sort of the parties have become, one of the parties has been radicalized. The other one sort of tried to stay a kind of wishy-washy, sort of liberal, neoliberal party. The other one kind of embraced forms of neo-fascism, ultimately, and sort of in a sort of strange, not internally sort of coherent or consistent mix with radical neoliberal and libertarian elements. So I think, indeed, there's also a difference between countries that have this binary system and others that have
Hmm.
different systems. But I think across the board, also in various, for instance, continental European countries, you see forms of, well, radicalization, right, is a term that is often used. But radicalization, of course, also comes with sort of, in a way, the suggestion that, yeah, this process is always and necessarily and inherently problematic. And of course, yeah, well, it can be very problematic. It can be very dangerous. But then there's often just this sort of a hand wringing and okay, how can we fight radicalization with the idea that somehow we need to return to, I don't know, perhaps to the 1990s or something, right? So I think there's also then a certain sort of liberal post-Cold War sort of nostalgia at work in many cases. I was interested in actually also really starting from, this experience that many of us share of indeed the perhaps the political divides getting more sharply articulated in some ways. I was started interested in starting from that experience, and then using this concept of schismogenesis from Bateson and then from Graeber and Wengrow to kind of think sort of with that, through that condition. And it's really an example for me of um, a concept sort of gaining a new lease on life and sort
Mm.
of just gaining a sort of new kind of anachronic or anachronistic contemporaneity and imposing itself almost because, okay, it turns out, according to my warped mind, it can actually be really useful. It has, use value in this situation. Um, and yeah, that is sort of how I started to think with that notion, trying to use it to think about, yeah, these forms of divergence, right, as I also call this phenomenon, as forms of schismogenesis, in order to address this as sort of a set of phenomena that can no longer be encompassed, I think, by sort of traditional frameworks where it's just about fighting, counteracting radicalization with the idea of returning to a kind of some kind of middle ground, some kind of lost consensus that I do not think can be restored because this consensus was actually also based on certain material conditions that are no longer there, material, social, technological conditions.
It's interesting because in some places I don't. Okay, I don't think in the UK the schism is happening as much. So what you're
Mm,
saying is the
mm,
UK right is becoming radicalized. Maybe not as much as the US, but somewhat, right?
mm.
And then the Labour Party ostensibly left like, well, what if we did like racism light?
Yeah, yeah,
And rather than actually defining itself in terms of providing an alternate set of values or principles to hold on to, it offers sort of like a sort of like light version of the horrible thing,
right.
and then gets surprised that people say no, we just want the horrible thing rather than the.
But that's exactly the American playbook, right? I mean,
Mm.
ultimately. And of course, there was an attempt under Corbyn to indeed present a sort of a clear counterpoint, right? But that was also, yeah, you might say that wasn't allowed to happen. I mean, it was a combination, I guess, of self-inflicted wounds and wounds inflicted by others. Um, but yeah, I mean, ultimately, this is what happens, I think, when you have sort of big parties, either in a sort of two-party system or in something that approximates it, like in the UK, the sort of the party that is supposed to be the liberal or progressive or somewhat social democratic party actually tends to be the party of a certain consensus, right? And of of a certain status quo. So Clinton and Biden were candidates of the status quo, and then Trump was able to present himself as the anti-status quo candidate. Um, yeah, and I
Yeah.
guess, yeah,
Then there's the moment we get caught between the horrible outsider and like the bland technocrat.
right, 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 right. I mean, I remember sort of with the first Trump election that I was absolutely convinced that he was going to win. And all my American friends told me, don't worry, it's never going to happen. So I do think there is, this is also perhaps um, by now, I think certain shocks have sunk in. And I think by now also we've all learned that indeed we shouldn't assume that indeed a certain post-Cold War status quo can go on indefinitely. And we've also learned the hard way that actually the more successful challenges or seeming apparent challenges are, in many cases, those presented by the far right, which is, of course, one major aspect of the current catastrophe. Um,
One of the things I remember before Trump's first election, I have a friend who's a quite well-known female anarchist artist, and I'll leave her nameless for the moment. But she was convinced that it would actually be better if Trump won for the sheer reason that she was convinced that if Hillary Clinton won, she would become so invested in having to perform her competence as being a good warmonger
Mm,
that the US would get involved in like three different wars at the same time.
right.
I'm not sure I necessarily
Mm,
buy that argument, but I do feel something the interesting thing of sort of yeah, if there would be a sort of way that Clinton would have been interpolated into a certain kind of military performance because of being female. I don't know.
right. I mean, that's not unlikely in a way, yeah. But democratic sort of, let's say, so-called centrist democratic politicians such as Obama, Clinton, and Biden tend to perform sort of that role or roll out that kind of playbook anyway, right? I mean, perhaps it would have been more extreme under Clinton. We cannot know. Um, but yeah, the absence of a sort of systemic alternative or let's say radical alternative from the left, which again also was nipped in the bud under sort of the DNC establishment with the Sanders campaign, whether you want to call that radical or not, but it was certainly more of an alternative than Clinton. The absence of this kind of alternative in those systems ultimately, of course, yeah, allows for um, a certain kind of carnivalesque far right type of candidate to present themselves as the radical alternative.
Hmm.
And I've seen this, in living in Holland, I've seen this very early on with the rise of Pim Fortuyn in around 2001, 2002. I mean, Holland was indeed the pioneer in that sense. So I've also had quite some time to study these mechanisms.
This is a bit off from your book, but I remember in 2009, Autonomy Media was publishing one of the first books in English about the Provo movement.
Oh yeah.
I know in the Netherlands that you're probably like done to death by hearing about like the glory of the 60s and counterculture because it's probably like overdone, right? But this was still relatively obscure for the English language. And so it had an event in London where he actually invited a bunch of the people over. Um, and for the most part, it was quite good until we started talking about contemporary politics. And then all these dudes went total boomer.
Oh yeah.
Like, as in, like they were like they started complaining about like these Muslim youths, and it was
Oh,
like, "Oh, really?
oh
Please,
wow.
please stop, please."
Wow. Oh wow. Okay. Uh-huh.
And
Uh-huh.
it was kind of at the time it was horrifying, but it was kind of funny because almost the same kind of tropes that were used in the 60s against the delinquent youths, they were like redeploying to against a different population. Well, I'm sorry, I should clarify. One or two people, not everyone.
No, no. Sure.
Um,
Sure.
um, and if any people are listening from the Netherlands, I am not hereby implying that all of Dutch counterculture is horrible. No, it's like
No, 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 no. But I think maybe what is perhaps ultimately more significant than sort of individual trajectories of particular boomers, because of course also in Germany you have horrifying biographies of people who were active in the APO in the 60s, part of the student movement, and who later became, full-blown fascists. There are some atrocious biographies in Germany when it comes to that. Less so in Holland, I would say, even though of course some have turned conservative. But I would say what is perhaps ultimately more significant is the fact that you can make a case for the adoption of, let's say, countercultural strategies or tactics later by the far right, by the alt-right, right? So shocking the bourgeoisie, épater les bourgeois, this whole fixation also of the Provo movement on images, right? On images that sort of cajoled the media, also playing the media. Certainly, this was something that Provo was very adept at. This is also something that people like Kunzelmann and others in the Subversive Aktion in Germany in the 60s were adept at. So yeah, without oversimplifying it and without saying, okay, there's a straight line from this to, let's say, alt-right memes, it's still worth looking into sort of specific genealogies or how certain tactics get uh, adopted and adapted and transformed over time. Also taking on board 1980s, 1990s tactical media. I remember that there was also a sense of shock among sort of some of the Dutch and also international tactical media people in 2016, 27. Oh, what happened with this alt-right phenomenon? We didn't see it coming, and they seem to have rummaged through our toolkit quite a bit. Which is not saying that these are completely identical forms, of course, or methods. One also shouldn't sort of oversimplify this. But I think it is true that, when you look at Bannon, for instance, flooding the zone with shit, when you look at a lot that's going on social media these days, I think it is true that a certain sort of countercultural habitus has, pardon me, has mutated and has, perhaps what has happened is what Adorno has always cautioned against in the 1960s. Adorno always cautioned against the proto-fascist elements in what he called actionismus. He chided the student movement for its actionismus, this insistence on direct action, which he felt was kind of a shortcut to a form of fascism, right? Of creating facts without any sort of attention being paid to due process, to the needs of others, let's say, without sort of due democratic process. Um, yeah, without necessarily fully agreeing with sort of old Teddy when it comes to that assessment of the student movement. This critique, I think, is also worth revisiting in the context of, recent
I mean,
far-right activism.
you could talk about it as recuperation, but that seems almost
Mm,
kind of like quasi-metaphysical at
right.
that point. Or you
Yeah.
could just make the even more obvious observation that any political or tactical approach that is effective, that moves people, will be studied and learned from by other political agents, because why wouldn't you?
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Which is also where ultimately it matters so much how and where, let's say, forms, tactics, strategies, how they are used, how they circulate, what kind of practice, what kind of practices are these part of, right? Because you can indeed say, okay, this or that has been recuperated, but it also very quickly becomes an oversimplified story about, oh, basically everything has been appropriated, recuperated, which shows that, it was all problematic to begin with because now the alt-right is doing it. Now the far right is doing it. But what is it, right? What is it? You can, of course, pinpoint certain maybe forms of provocation, right? Provo deriving its name from provocation, of course, and saying, okay, now so much far right politics is about trolling, it's about provocation. But that's not necessarily the same type of provocation, right? It's not part of the same type of practice. So what are the practices? And this is also where I think, yeah, where one has to be careful.
Hmm. Yeah. Or you could also look at other aspects of it. I mean, for instance, with Provo, it's not just about provoking, but it's also about there's sort of there are different plans for utopian practices in the city, like the White Housing
Yes,
Plan,
yes, yes,
public transport.
absolutely,
And so it was
absolutely.
critically the combination of
Yes.
tactical provocation with also like thoughtful alternatives of how to organize things differently.
Absolutely. And I just actually had a student, a research master student, who wrote a really nice essay about basically revolving around the question, can we consider Provo to have been a form of prefigurative practice, right? And then she, of course, goes into different accounts, different theories, different definitions of prefiguration, prefigurative politics. And then she looks at Provo. And of course, well, it's a research, it's an essay written for a research seminar. It's not a thesis, so it's quite condensed. But it's a really interesting way of looking at Provo, of reconsidering Provo as indeed um, also revolving around different ways of organizing. And right, they also at some point became really interested in the council form, in councils. They, of course, had this notion of the provotariat, right? So a certain class, which was not identical to the old proletariat, but which is sort of an urban, on the one hand, sort of lumpen proletariat, but also with a lot of highly educated people. So to some extent, prefiguring, more recent accounts of the multitude and what have you. And indeed, they became involved with squatting and with creating social forms in the city, creating forms of life in this decaying, crumbling old city of Amsterdam in particular, defending the fabric of the old city and its inhabitants against, these sort of Robert Moses-like schemes about, damming the canals and building huge highways instead of the old. I mean, they really stopped that. They really prevented a nightmare from happening. So
Or,
indeed,
or even have things like what was it called? The white chicken plan, where they wanted to
yes,
get rid of cops
yes,
in favor of social workers, which
yes.
is basically kind of like proto-abolitionism, right? Where
Yes. Oh, yes, absolutely, absolutely. So I think this is a really good counterpoint to this narrative, which, of course, has a certain degree of truth. Otherwise, it would have no traction at all. But it's a partial truth. It is, I think, an important counterpoint to this narrative about how basically everything that the student movement and the counterculture did in the 60s has been co-opted and has been turned into basically the toolkit of the alt-right and whatnot. This insistence on sort of a more integral look of these 60s practices, what they stood for, but also really how they functioned as practices, not just as a certain type of content that can also be memified, right? We have to also counter, let's say, memification when it comes to our understanding of historical movements.
well, it's almost like that kind of critique almost sort of falls back on a kind of like a commodity, kind of like a superficial understanding of tactics, where you
Yeah.
look at the shiny stuff on top
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
fail to look at all the underlying processes, which are maybe not as fun to talk about, but
Right, 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 right. Yeah, yeah. But I think also this, yeah, this is, I think, also crucial for some of the genealogies in the book. And when it comes to, yeah, when it comes to forms of potential or actual prefigurative practice within these sort of schismogenetic tendencies, schismogenic or schismogenetic. I'm not actually at the moment, I'm not sure what the correct adjective would be. Perhaps both work equally. But within this conjuncture of yeah, these processes of schismogenesis, of divergence, for me, indeed, it is really crucial to look at forms of life, you might also say. That's also a notion that I've worked on, not so much in this book, but elsewhere, and that I continue to be interested in. It's important to look at practice, not just on sort of programmatic points or statements or memes, but you have to look at indeed how perhaps different social forms are actually being developed with all the contradictions and limitations within the shell of the old society, right? And then the question, of course, is okay, what is the far right, right? What are the forces of fascism actually doing within the shell of the old society? They want to intensify and radicalize yeah, some of the most violent features that are already there and roll them out more widely, I would say.
Mm-mm. I mean, to give you an interesting example of that sort of something like that, there was part of my family for a while that I think I would say was very much on the far right, religiously and politically.
Mhm.
One of the things I found interesting about that part of the family is they decided to homeschool their kids because they don't want to hear about the dangers of evolution or whatever, right? Now, obviously, I wasn't a big fan of that, but I did like seeing how they developed really interesting networks of mutual support and solidarity for these families working with each other outside of the school system.
Right,
Now, I could see that being as being important to learn from, even if I didn't like the reasons of why they were doing it.
right, right. I mean, in a way, that's also, of course, part of the part of a certain type of conservatism is, of course, also, yeah, the idealization not just of the nuclear family, but also of the forms of support that can, yeah, that do, of course, exist within networks of families that have the same religious beliefs, right? So there are forms of mutual support there. They are just yeah, they're quite exclusive, obviously, right? So perhaps that's the problem then, this exclusivity among
Yeah,
other things. Yeah.
it's almost like you know, and maybe this is another form of recuperation. It's almost like I wanted to be like, how could I take the structural forms of those organized networks and put them to good uses? And
Right.
then the people will be like, you're recuperating
Right,
our
right.
solidarity networks.
Right. But the question always also is, right, what can be sort of put to how can you put something to a different use and what do you actually need to change, right? I mean, it's sort of the problem with a certain kind of traditional Marxist approach to taking over the state, right? Taking over the state apparatus, but now we'll put it to, now it will work for the working class. Now it will be in the service of the proletariat rather than in the service of the capitalist. But okay, but what does that mean? How can the same structure suddenly be put to, emancipatory ends? Right. And of course, I'm oversimplifying it now, but obviously that is a very fundamental debate. But I think it's just in general an important question to ask yourself also indeed on smaller scales and in different contexts. What do I actually, what kind of, let's say, what is hidden inside the structure or what will the structure keep on doing, also to me when I appropriate it or recuperate it?
One thing I was just reading this weekend, and I'm sorry, it's not your book, but I was reading them.
That's acceptable. Other books exist.
Do you know Ben Maria?
Yes, Black Mask, motherfucker, up against the wall, motherfucker. Yes, I heard about this. I haven't
So
seen this one yet.
this book is really amazing. I should realize I need to say what it is because this could be an audio recording. Full Circle: Life of the Rebellion by Maria. And the reason why it's super interesting is because I know mainly about Black Mask and Up Against the Wall through,
Hmm.
let's say, their street actions, their protests, their confrontational actions, kind of in a bit like Provo. But what I get at reading that was the way that sort of like they had this network of squats and crash houses that organized for like people who were runaways or need houses, or they would do these immense community meals. So basically, we're really and learning about sort of like not just the sort of like confrontation protests they would have, but almost like these sort of like structural alternatives they developed in somewhere like the Lower East Side, where they actually had a huge community networks that of support.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting indeed that you don't get so much of a sense of that from their magazines, right? From their publications. Yeah, that's hmm. Or perhaps I should have another look at them with this in mind. But I also need to get this book. Sounds great. Hmm.
Well, that's one of the things I mean, I suppose that sort of like their publications were more like flyers and sort of like
Right.
they wrote off
Yeah.
quickly for actions,
Right.
and they weren't someone almost as like writing a sort of like guidebook for how they were what they were doing in their everyday life, which is
Yeah.
yeah. So
Right.
that sort of like everyday life stuff kind of like fell away and in the histories a bit.
Right. I mean, you have some sort of some movements and some groups that really foreground this, right? Of course, what you also get with, for instance, the Kommune 1 in Germany around that time is that they also really mediatized and publicized and spectacularized their alternative lifestyle in this commune, right? They welcomed the press and what have you. But with other movements, including also, I would say, the situationists and also clearly sort of the Ben Maria milieu, a lot happened in terms of sort of countercultural Lebenspraxis that yeah, that isn't necessarily that visible.
Mm.
Perhaps also sometimes at the time, perhaps also there was also a conscious decision for a certain opacity, right? It may not always have been advisable to make everything public.
Yeah, I mean, and that's another interesting part of this particular book is there comes a certain point where in the late 60s where there's a lot of, let's say, targeted assassinations and violence
Yeah,
against people. And this is the point where Ben and his partner basically decide to leave the city and go live in sort of the woods for like 30 years. Um,
right.
so there was a very sort of like, yeah, there was a well, also, I get the feeling that Ben in particular more didn't want to be a very public person, so doesn't usually sort of write about himself very much as he can. But
Mm,
that's a different conversation. But maybe one thing I want to get on to is thinking about, and this is just something that comes up in a number of books that Minor Compositions has published, certain notions about trying to desert the institution.
right.
Um, and then trying to sort of find ways of let's say modes of critique where you both leave and don't leave. But one of the problems with that, and this is something I've been thinking a lot more, is that, like, for instance, if you read, like, Stefano and Fred with their of the other comments, a lot of the times, the idea now about saying, like, deserting the institution seems almost different because I feel like institutions have deserted us.
Mm,
Or like we used to say, like, okay, stay there, but steal all you can.
right. Yeah, yeah,
But now it feels like there's nothing left.
right. Yeah, yeah. Perhaps also, yeah, perhaps the desertion can indeed go the other way, or it can be mutual. Yeah, yeah. No,
And,
that's a
and
really
so I'm kind of struck about how to negotiate this attempt to desert the institution at a point where it kind of feels like the institution has deserted you, and all that's left is sort of like a disciplinary labor framework.
right, 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 right. Yeah. To what extent can you even still undercommon the institution? Yeah. No, I think that's a really interesting point that I think, yeah, we will also have to keep keep working on, I guess. I think in the context of this book, what was important for me was to also really discuss these notions of desertion or develop this kind of autonomous approach to imminent desertion in the context of this overarching discussion of, yeah, forms of schismogenesis, forms of divergence. So um, perhaps what has shifted, what has changed is that there used to be indeed more of a sense of, okay, there is a certain status quo, there is a certain social order. Yes, of course, we know it's changing. But at this point, we can say, for instance, okay, the American university, yeah, it's a neoliberal nightmare. All we can do is sort of desert from it imminently, undercommon it, steal from it. But then if once the process has sort of reached a point indeed where even that is perhaps no longer viable, um, yeah, then what does that mean for that notion? Which I think is where perhaps it has to be rethought or can be rethought within this framework of um, yeah, of schismogenic tendencies. Okay, so right now, for instance, there's clearly a certain amount of interest among American academics in potentially moving to Europe, right? So you get these questions, people put out feelers, right? And you kind of usually have to disappoint them. It's not as though this is sort of the land of plenty where, you can just get a job at any time. And of course, that idea of, okay, sort of fleeing from one country to the next host country, yeah, that also has its limitations and its problems. At some point, also, you may run out of countries. Um, but yeah, so clearly we cannot count on a certain sort of situation in which there is one particular um, notion or one particular sort of tactic of imminent desertion or of undercommoning that can be replicated, right? That can be replicated, reiterated within the institution, or that can be replicated in a different institution. Does desertion also then, can it mean among certain circumstances, can it mean that you actually flee from one country to the next, and then you start all over again, and then you continue your sort of undercommoning practice there because this country is still a bit more liberal, so you can basically take your practice and move it to a different country and then try to replicate it there, right? I mean, and then, okay, once that country perhaps falls, you move on to the next one, right? Is that a certain sort of bizarre domino effect type of scenario? Or are there ways indeed of, do you have to say, okay, now we need to, this is also, of course, yeah, a lot of these conversations are happening probably with around you as well. Can we, must we, and can we create alternative institutions, counter institutions, really flee more literally, more explicitly from the institution? How could you, create and make sustainable something that is not a traditional accredited university or a traditional art space? So then indeed you go from that kind of imminent desertion to a desertion that leaves the traditional institution. But of course, to the extent that you are trying to create some kind of alternative or counter institution, it is arguably still sort of an imminent critical practice within, yeah, within a certain system, right? Unless you really think you can go off grid altogether, right? So then, yeah, there would be various degrees and admixtures of sort of imminent critique and sort of a more radical, perhaps, desertion.
I mean, okay, if I can be a little bit mean about 60s counterculture, which I think I can do for a second, since, um, but like, okay, like in the mid 60s, or like or even the 70s, you had this idea, or actually for much longer, like, okay, the university is a problem. We're going to flee the university and set up free schools. And,
Mm.
and part of me really likes that. But then part of me goes, well, hold a second. If you're fleeing the institution, but then your project is setting up a free school, have you actually left the institution at all? You've actually maintained the institutional idea of that as a structure. I mean, take for instance here. I mean, okay, I really like someone like Alexander Trotsky, the idea of Project Sigma. His idea of the spontaneous university. It's fleeing the space, but it's almost like keeping a lot of some of the structure mentally,
Right,
even if
right.
you're outside of it.
Right, that's the difference between the MoMA and the institution of art, or it's the difference between, let's say, Oxford University and the university as an institution. Of course, you can also argue that, okay, some of these alternative institutions, self-organized universities are, a different kind of beast, right? Yes, they are universities, but perhaps they could also be seen as sort of appropriations of the aura of the university, putting it to different ends. So to what extent do they actually replicate the structures? I'm also not necessarily a believer in sort of abstract negation. And, as a historian, I don't really believe in tabula rasa, you know, I don't. So I'm also not necessarily a subscriber to a certain type of discourse that's basically, to put it in an oversimplified manner, says, okay, we need to decolonize everything totally 100% right now. And that means indeed abolishing all existing institutions and all curricula and, basically everything must go, right? I don't believe in everything must go. Many things need to go. But so, yeah, what might it mean indeed to develop alternative institutions, then indeed you do not desert the institution as such, right? But is that humanly possible, right? If we take a Graeberesque approach to it, right, we might say that, okay, if we look at sort of pre-capitalist societies, for instance, some were more statist, right? Others were and more vertical, others were more horizontal, but sort of even, and one might think back even to Pierre Clastres, right? Society against the state, which I think David Graeber was also quite critical of in some ways. But even if we say, okay, some traditional pre-modern societies were very horizontal, and but this also means that they put certain structures in place. They actually had certain institutions that produced that kind of outcome, right? So yes, you can deschool society to some extent. You can also abolish universities, and yeah, at this point, perhaps we must. But even there, I still think for now in Holland it's getting very close to the point where indeed I ask myself, okay, does this still have use value? Can this still be put to good uses? I guess at the moment it's sort of, an annual question. Um, but yeah,
Here's a weird way to put it. You know that the cliche phrase, "A puppy isn't for Christmas, it's for life."
right,
There's this one of the things that the two Davids get to is the idea that maybe at certain points the state wasn't for life, but was almost
right,
like a seasonal thing. Like,
right,
kind of like sometimes, you make a state for harvest, for sowing agricultural time, then you desert it for summer. Or
right.
maybe you could almost get into the idea about there being like patterns of desertion and rebuilding.
Yeah,
Maybe not literally seasonally, but maybe over across time spans.
yeah, yeah. No, I mean that also then in a way links back to practices that I've also discussed in organizational forms where you do have organizations, for instance, organizations run by artists that are relatively autonomous, but they are still connected. They still sort of dock onto existing institutional structures for funding purposes, for instance. But indeed, it's interesting to think of desertion in that sense as a kind of almost like an oscillating, undulating movement, right? Where indeed there is sort of perhaps indeed a seasonal quality to it, without, of course, not necessarily in a literal way, but there can be moments, right? There can be sort of a dialectical movement, which, for instance, in relation to the university, would then mean, okay, perhaps it's not about a binary choice, right? To return to binaries between maintaining the university as it is because it's changing anyway and it's crumbling on the one hand and sort of moving out altogether. But yeah, how could it be seen as part of sort of a constellation, right? A constellation of spaces, physical and other spaces, sites, institutional, non-institutional, alter-institutional entities. How could it function, perhaps at times partially as part of such a constellation, right? So, for instance, also in Berlin, when some German academics were prevented from their university of organizing a meeting, a kind of sort of workshop or teaching in with Eyal Weizmann and Francesca Albanese, right? The university told them no way. And they would have also sent the police, and they have sent the police in many similar cases. Um, they then hosted this event offsite in a space run by a small left-wing newspaper, which is just one very specific example. But I think this kind of constellational approach, allowing for different degrees and forms of desertion um, in this kind of perhaps not quite seasonal but dialectical movement, this is sort of sketching it in very broad strokes, but I think, that's more or less where we are at now, I would say, probably.
It reminds me, okay, this is be a weird comparison, but I used to know some friends from Prague, and they were squatters.
Hmm.
And the one thing they did, which I thought was really brilliant, is as squatters, they pooled their money and bought one place. But here was the function of the one place. The one place they owned existed. So whenever they got kicked out of somewhere else, they would move their stuff to the one place until they squatted somewhere else. So it wasn't a sort of like a
Right.
pure binary of like we was always squat and never pay rent. It was the use of legal space to
Yes.
underpin autonomous space rather than thinking it as completely different.
Yes. And I just also attended this meeting with people who were involved with the refugee group We Are Here. Um, and so these were mostly sort of asylum seekers who were, they say, uitgeprocedeerd in Holland. So basically their procedure had ended and they could not get asylum, but in some cases they also couldn't be sent back. And they certainly didn't want to go back. It would have been dangerous in many cases. So they were stuck in this legal limbo as sort of, yeah, illegal aliens or semi-legal tolerated aliens. And so then they got some also support from local activists, and one of them, Elke Uytenthuis, who does come out of the squatting movement, she said, well, at a certain point we could get this space, which was sort of an abandoned empty office building or commercial building, but then we struck a deal with the owner, and we could be there sort of for a number of years in this what they call an anti-kraak construction in Holland. So you are there basically as a kind of guard. You are not squatting, but you're actually sort of the anti-squatting guard. And she said, okay, I was not really comfortable with that coming out of the squatting movement. Why would I actually agree to do this and thereby also legitimate this system of property that I'm against? I want to squat. I don't want to be a sort of an anti-squatting guard. But the refugees all said, no, I mean, actually, we need this right now, and let's do this. And so they also did use this sort of, in a way, affordance of the law, which of course is a compromise. It's impure. It doesn't have, the beautiful sort of radicalism of the gesture of squatting, but it was clearly the sensible thing to do, and it made a big difference. So indeed, it's not for somebody like her and for many others. I think it's no longer necessarily this choice between, okay, either we go completely down the autonomous route and we squat and we sort of form our sort of as sort of distinctly as possible and go for full opacity, or we enter into compromises. Yeah, compromises can also be tactical, right? And they can also be part of the sort of overall um, patchwork, the overall assemblage of strategies, right? Just as, yeah, I think we also need to get out of this opposition between the vertical forms and horizontal forms, right? That deadlock also has to be.
And in that particular case, the most pressing question isn't like, how does it make you feel about your squatter cred, but
No,
what benefits does it produce for people who are in this indeterminate state, and how does it actually enrich their lives?
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely, yeah, yeah, yeah. And in a way, it's not about either theoretical purity or about indeed a kind of street cred. Um, it is about being very, yeah, pragmatic, strategic, and tactical, and perhaps at times combining seemingly incompatible approaches or approaches that would seem to be incompatible from the standpoint of doctrinal sort of
Mhm.
purity.
So speaking of pragmatics, I think we should probably nudge us to a conclusion, just because in today's economy, information attention economy, I've learned that it's good to keep these around an hour.
Yeah.
So maybe as a point to sort of uh, eh, go to a pause or an end, maybe just a very sort of general question about, well, one thing I should say is I basically ignored most of my questions, but that's okay because I think it was much better that way. Um, but sort of, and I like staying this idea of getting rid of purity in terms of dangerous mutating hybrids that actually are more fitting to whatever catastrophe we're inhabiting. But where do you go from here? Where's your thinking go? Or do you, or do you, or you're someone like I don't, for myself, I don't know what I'm thinking until I've actually written the thing.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. The writing is not sort of a translation of pre-existing thoughts. The writing is the medium of articulation and of development. Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, one quote in the book that I really like is from Huey Newton: "There will always be contradictions, or else everything would stop." And so I am, continuing to sort of think and work through my own contradictions and the broader contradictions. And yeah, of course, this book is unfinished business. It's sort of a freeze frame in a way, but I think it's also meaningful as a freeze frame. Yeah, one question that you sent me beforehand, which we didn't really get around, did get me thinking about indeed what I also think is somewhat unfinished in the book is sort of the role of art in it and of aesthetics, because of course the book is sort of, you know, suffused with that. It's everywhere, but I don't necessarily make any sort of grand programmatic statements about it, which I'm also a bit uncomfortable about. I don't necessarily want to do that, but I am interested in indeed analyzing and thinking through sort of specific different approaches. For instance, when it comes to yeah, organizational modes developed by artists, artist organizations, forms of assemblies, right? Forms of gathering. What does it mean to structure a space in a certain way, to gather in a certain way? You know, and then you have also very different approaches. And yeah, art itself has certain affordances, but also certain limitations, of course, when it is sort of in the institutional framework of art. So let's say aesthetics within art, but also aesthetic practices that are not necessarily always contained by art. Yeah, that is something that I keep working on. Right now, I'm working on a text on sort of propositions, on sort of the propositional dimension of certain artistic practices, but also on propositions sort of as a force in politics. I'm working on, yeah, forms of life and on that notion, which also takes sort of an aesthetic approach to form, but then also extends it to social forms, and also it has an ecological dimension. This is probably not a very, it's certainly not a very concise, and it's probably not a very good answer to your question. But yeah, my answer is that I keep, it is unfinished business, and I keep, in a way, returning to the problems that I have here developed up to a certain point.
Oh,
Um,
and way, I think it's an excellent answer because what you're talking about is thinking about not thinking about art as objects or histories, but
Right.
thinking about art as a series of practices that make other things possible, that provide affordances. And once you start thinking about art as a series of practices that make other realities, other lives, other forms of life possible, then it's never over.
No, no,
There is no, oh, it's done, we finished art.
no, no,
Um,
no.
yeah, so it's a good answer in that yeah, it just keeps going.
It keeps going. The question often is one of, okay, where and how can this art happen? Because of course there is also a marginalization of more alternative spaces and sort of a certain model that is quite dominant. But yeah, in Holland, for instance, you also have great smaller spaces like the Appel in Amsterdam, run by Lara Caldi, also working with many collectives, and Bak in Utrecht, now run by Janne van Heeswijk. And there, I think forms of real alterity are possible, and forms of sort of prefiguration, prefigurative practice are possible, even though, of course, they are within institutions. But I would here again, the question to me is what kind of institutions are these, and to what use are certain institutional structures put? And there I would say, yeah, these are indeed institutions of a certain relative alterity. These are institutional practices of imminent desertion. So, you know, indeed, that's what I also sort of affiliate myself with, ally myself with critically, of course.
Okay. And Don has put here in the chat the Art of Assembly project, which is quite cool. And maybe this is something we'll come back to in the future. Things that's a really good example. And I know that our dear departed friend Marina Vishba is going to have her posthumous book out coming out about infrastructural critique, which I think will pick up similar kind of themes as well.
Yes. Yes,
Quite
absolutely.
cool.
I mean, Marina, of course, has been and in a way continues to be a very important sort of interlocutor, that dialogue. I mean, the dialogue is a bit more one-sided now, but in that way, it continues.
Cool, cool. Okay, well, I'll pause here. Go. Burp.